goal to visit all of the United States national parks with her husband, photographer Nick Minetor. So she really has a lot under her belt. So without further ado, I'll give the screen to Randi Minetor.
Terrific. And I will just share my screen here so you can see what I see. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, I thank you so much, Linda and Russ, for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to folks on Long Island. And I thank all of you as Audubon members and people who understand the value of protecting our outdoors and our open spaces and the birds and animals that we enjoy so much sharing our world with. It's one of the reasons I came to write The Complete Language of Birds. It's totally connected to my travels across the United States. Nick is my husband, and I have been to all 50 states and to national parks in every single state, and we have birded in every single state. So this all came about because of our quest to see all of the parks in the national park system. So, whoops, there we go. Whoop. Okay. It's going to move that over. Okay, so we've been at this process of trying to see every park in the national park system since November 2000, when Nick bought our first Passport to Your National Parks. I'm sure a lot of you recognize that little blue book that we put so much value on. We bought ours at Antietam National Battlefield in Maryland and started collecting passport stamps in November 2000 on Veterans Day. This is a very expensive hobby, so I needed to find a way to subsidize this absurd challenge that we had undertaken. I woke up one day with an idea. I decided to become a travel and nature writer and earn enough money to keep going. And thank goodness that worked. Okay. When you visit all of the national parks and monuments and memorials and battlefields and historic sites and everything else that's part of the national park system, you learn a lot about things that people believed before we had the science and technology that we enjoy today. So the National Park Service includes dozens of sites that tell stories of indigenous people living throughout the continent and what they perceived about the world around them. These sites preserve remnants of cultures that lived thousands of years ago, including a wealth of mythology and folklore involving birds and animals. So Nick and I have not been overseas yet, but my editor at Quarto Publishing wanted a book that could be sold all over the world. So it had to include the folklore and mythology of many different cultures. So the research for this was really unusually challenging for me, as many of these stories have been passed down for thousands of years only by word of mouth. So finding their origins was really tricky. But thanks to the work of historians who captured the oral histories and wrote them down, and of librarians who know where to look, I've compiled this encyclopedia of more than 400 birds and their stories throughout the ages. So let's go back all the way to creation. In the beginning, there was a goose. This goose, in fact, an Egyptian goose, and at the time, the only being in the universe. Egyptians call this Gengenware, or the Great Honker. This goose carried and protected the egg that, when hatched, would produce all of the life on Earth. But another being actually laid this egg, Geb, god of Earth, also known by the nickname Great Cackler. Whether or not Geb was actually a goose himself is subject to interpretation, but when he evolved into human form over the centuries, he often wore an Egyptian goose or another bird as part of his headdress. Egypt's creation story also includes a third being, Amun, Lord of the Thrones, who also liked to take the form of a goose, as you can see in this petroglyph from thousands of years ago. In fact, the legend says that Amun's goose cry of victory over his adversaries became the very first sound heard by the people of Earth. And to commemorate this, Amun is known as the Great Shrieker. So Jeb laid a golden egg that contained the sun. Gengenware incubated and hatched the egg that brought all of the other beings into existence, and Amun's goose presence scared off all the early adversaries. The result was, well, let there be light. Who knew that geese could be so powerful? Down at the southern tip of Africa, a whole other creation was going on. The indigenous Khoisan people tell the story of their creator, a god called Sui-Gob, who ignited a great fire to bring all of the traits of the animals out of the ether and into reality. He gathered all of these traits and he baked them into all kinds of animal shapes. Kind of gives new meaning to Christmas cookies, doesn't it? And as he did this, a Cory bustard, a very large bird with broad wings, served as his helper. The Cory bustard fanned the flames with his wings, keeping the fire burning until all of the animals were fully baked. And in a wonderful Aboriginal story from Australia, all life began in the dark, skulking its way around Earth as best it could. The spirits of the sky spent part of an eternity deciding how they would bring light into the world. They built a huge pile of sticks that they planned to ignite, but they didn't want to frighten all the beings on the ground by suddenly producing a big burst of light, something they had never seen before. Well, one day, an emu named Dinawan and a brolga named Bralach sat side by side on their nests, protecting their eggs in the dark. And as they talked about the children they would bring into the world soon, they began to argue over whose children would be stronger and whose would be more clever, like any two pregnant women. The discussion became more and more heated, and finally, Bralach grabbed one of Dinawan's eggs in her bill and used all of her fury to throw it as high as she could into the sky. It went so high that it collided with a huge pile of sticks collected by the spirits. The egg broke open, the yolk spilled over the sticks, which somehow kindled a bonfire. The sky lit up, bathed the earth in light, and showed everyone just how beautiful Australia is. And from that day forward, the spirits decided that they would build a great fire every morning to light up the earth and let it burn until evening. But they still worried that the transition to light every day would frighten the animals. So they searched for one animal who could call to everybody each morning before they lit the fire to let them know that light was on its way soon. And what animal did they choose? Well, if you've been to Australia, you know it's the laughing kookaburra, who was only too happy to volunteer to play this very important role. And to this day, this devoted bird wakes up the entire continent by calling just before sunrise. Now, after the birds helped get the world up and running, they continued to play pivotal roles in the early days of the Earth. One of the big surprises for me was in researching this book was the sheer number of cultures around the world that record a great flood in their origin stories, just like we do. We all know the story of Noah and the ark, and that as the waters began to recede once the 40-day flood stopped, Noah released first a raven and then a dove to see if they would find land. The raven never returned, and people suggest that maybe it found some nice waterlogged carrion to munch on and forgot all about the ark and didn't care anymore. But the dove felt more of a duty to Noah for saving its life, so it brought back an olive leaf, and that meant that the water had begun to recede and that land was emerging. Well, other cultures tell the story a little differently. In some areas of the United States, Christians associate the painted bunting with the rainbow that God sent to Noah as a sign of his covenant with the earth. Painted buntings, of course, are the living embodiment of the rainbow, one of the most beautiful birds in America, reminding us that God protects us and will not destroy his creation again. Now, in the Biracek area of Turkey, people believe that Noah released a northern bald ibis from the ark, a bird they see as a symbol of fertility to guide the repopulation of the earth. And the Athabascans of Alaska believe that the Great Flood came to an end with the help of the American bittern. The bitterns got together and swallowed enormous amounts of water, flew up to where the water would do most good, and regurgitated the water to reform new rivers like these braided rivers that you see up in Alaska. Meanwhile, an Ojibwa legend tells us that long ago, the Creator sent a great flood to purify the world and drown everything evil. And one man, Wayne Abujo, worked quickly and built himself a raft and managed to keep himself and just a few animals afloat for an entire month as they waited for the water to recede. The water didn't go down, though. So he summoned several different birds to dive to the bottom and retrieve some dirt from the old world, which he would then use to create a new continent. Well, the loon was the logical savior, but he tried and he failed. Then the dove volunteered, but you can imagine how that went. The poor thing nearly drowned. So finally, a lone coot heard the problem and took it upon himself to take the challenge without telling anyone what he intended. Time passed, and then the other birds finally noticed he was gone and started to search for him. They found him floating behind the raft, unconscious, but still breathing. And sure enough, when they started to resuscitate him, they found just a little bit of dirt in his bill. The coot had saved them, and Wayne Abujo could restart the continent. Now, it's worth noting that many other Native American legends of the Great Flood tell the same story, but with a different waterfowl as a hero. In the Algonquin culture, for example, it's a merganser who brings up the morsel of earth using its strong feet to push off from the raft to give it that momentum to get all the way to the bottom, and then that little sharp bill that it can grab that earth with. Now, according to a Maori legend in New Zealand, the god Tawaki, who makes lightning and thunder, caused the flood when he created the crystal floor of heaven. The crystal floor caused all the water in the sky to fall in one place, on Fiordland, where the Fiordland penguins live. This area receives some of the most torrential rain in New Zealand, so the Fiordland penguins have been credited with actually making the rainfall and perhaps assisting Tawaki in creating the Great Flood. Meanwhile, in the jungles of Panama, the Great Flood serves as an origin story for the Great Tinamou. It seems that after the flood covered the world in water, the sun returned and a rainbow appeared, and the Great Tinamou, a dun-colored bird that blends right in with the foliage around it, saw the rainbow, and its intense color just frightened it to death. It flew away from all of the other animals and retreated into the murkiest part of the forest where it lives to this day, hiding from the sun and from colors. So these are just a few of the flood-related stories I found where birds play a starring role, but these amazing birds have many more legends to teach us throughout the world's folklore and mythology. Now, before I started work on the complete language of birds, I had not really thought much about what birds must have represented to ancient civilizations. We take so much knowledge for granted now, but there was once a time when people knew very little science about birds' habits and behaviors. So when these people looked at the world around them and all the things they couldn't explain, they filled in some of those gaps with birds and their amazing abilities. Now, here's one of my favorite examples of this. Before science understood what we do now about migration and how it happens, it seemed to many observers that birds simply vanished in the fall and reemerged in spring from whatever hiding places they had used over the winter. And one of the most bizarre theories about this in the days when science was still called philosophy was that the barnacle goose, a European species not unlike our own Canada goose, became a barnacle when the weather changed. Theorists back in the 500s saw the barnacles along wharves and docks and on the bottoms of their boats, so they guessed that these geese somehow transformed into tiny little barnacles, adhered to surfaces, and waited out the winter. And in spring, the warmer weather gave them the cue they needed to transform back into geese. Now, back in 350 BC, the learned Greek philosopher Aristotle theorized that swallows, with their ability to dive so close to the surface of the lakes and ponds, actually dove to the bottom in fall and burrowed into the mud to wait out the winter. The whole oxygen thing was kind of lost on Aristotle. They hadn't really figured out the air necessity for things to live yet. But this theory actually held on until the late 1700s, when sailors returning from Europe from warmer climates at the end of winter reported seeing flocks of swallows in Africa and finally put two and two together. Then in 1822, the concept of migration reached a turning point. German villagers shot down a white stork that had a wooden spear piercing its neck. The spear's unusual wood could only have come from Africa, so in a flash of insight, the German hunters realized that this bird must have migrated all the way to another continent and back. So a single white stork in 1822 finally changed the way ornithologists understood migration. That being said, so much of what people around the world attribute to birds has really nothing whatsoever to do with science. Wondrous parrots like the imperial Amazon, the national bird of the Commonwealth of Dominica, and the gray parrot, one of the most common parrots in the African areas, are believed to have the ability to communicate with the spiritual realm. Not only can they fly high enough to reach the gods in the clouds, but they can actually form words. So you may need to watch what you say around a parrot, or he may tattle to the ruling spirits, or worse, your deceased loved ones, and imagine what waits for you when you get up there to heaven. One of our favorite North American birds, the anhinga, has represented different things to different cultures. We know that the bird's classic stance, holding its wings out to dry after diving for a fish dinner. We know that the anhingas do this, and some Christians see this as a symbol of the crucifix, making the anhinga a perpetual reminder of the passion of Christ, and therefore selfless, forgiving, and holy. On the other hand, the indigenous Tupi people of Brazil gave the anhinga its name, which it turns out means devil bird in their language. They determined that the anhinga has to be a trickster and a troublemaker. They reached this conclusion because the bird swims with its body submerged and only its head and neck out of the water, resembling a snake. Such a creature has got to be a sneaky thing, right? So here's one of my favorites. Two categories of birds, magpies and mynas, depending on where you live, require us to be especially respectful when we see them, asking after their health and their family's welfare. If we treat them with disdain or ignore them altogether, we may meet a particular fate based on how many of the birds we see together. So there's even a nursery rhyme to make this clear. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. So whenever you see a myna or a magpie, be sure to greet it warmly. Good afternoon, sir or miss. How are you today? Is your family well? If you're with a group and you don't want to look like a lunatic, just smile and nod or bow slightly. I'm told the bird will understand. Now, when you go to Hawaii, Hawaii is loaded with common mynas. They're not native there, but there's tons of them. They're like the starling of Hawaii. And you had to see me walking around there nodding to all the mynas like a nutcase. Now, one of my favorite stories involves the common kingfisher, a gorgeous bright blue bird of the rivers and lakes of Europe, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Asian continent, and of course, a relative of our belted kingfisher, ringed kingfisher, and green kingfisher in North America. Now, this is the tragic tale of Ceyx and Alcyone, two lovers in the days when Greek culture involved many gods living on Mount Olympus. Ceyx and Alcyone were soulmates, but equally important at the time, they were particularly well matched in physical beauty. So this made the couple very popular with the gods, who observed their romance with great interest, much the way we watch The Bachelor today. The pair married and they began a life together, and they were so happy that they gave each other little nicknames, as most married couples do. Unfortunately, they chose to call each other Zeus and Hera, the names of the two gods at the very top of the Greek pantheon. Well, instead of Zeus being flattered by this, they made him very angry. Zeus was kind of a passive-aggressive jerk. So one day, when Ceyx boarded a ship to Ionia, Zeus kicked up a storm, and his wrath created a massive wave that swallowed up the ship. Ceyx drowned, and his body sank to the bottom of the sea. Now, Hera knew how devastated Alcyone would be if she never knew for certain what had happened to Ceyx. So as she watched the young woman wait and weep by the shore, Hera caused Ceyx's body to wash up near where Alcyone waited for word of him. And Alcyone, anguished by her loss, threw herself into the sea and drowned. Well, now Zeus felt remorse for the revenge he had exacted, and he resurrected both of them from the dead. But he turned the two lovers into halcyon birds, naming them for Alcyone. Today we know them as common kingfishers, and every summer for 2 weeks, the winds go calm so the kingfishers can nest on the beach and bring a brood into the world. We call these the halcyon days, a period of calm and happiness, and Alcyone remains part of the taxonomic name for several of the world's kingfishers. Now, have you ever wondered how goldfinches got their bright yellow color? The Iroquois people did, and the story's been passed down for generations right here in New York State. It seems a fox chased a raccoon to make the little bandit its dinner. The raccoon ran up a tree, so the hungry fox waited all day at the bottom, but the raccoon did not come down. Eventually, the fox dozed off, and when he awoke, he found that the raccoon was, of course, gone, but before it left, it painted the fox's eyes shut with resin from the tree. The resin had hardened, and it wouldn't come off. The fox called and called and called for help, and some drab little finches that happened to be in the neighborhood took pity on him. So they flew in, and they pecked off the resin. The fox thanked them for this good deed by using some yellow flowers nearby to color their plumage bright yellow, the color of sunshine. So the goldfinches wear this plumage all spring and summer to this day. And I picked Canada goldenrod as a likely candidate for the native plant that gave the goldfinches their color. Now, the story of the trapped fox and the helpful bird is one of the tales that shows up in folklore of many different cultures, where it may be used to explain hummingbirds' iridescence or the bright color of a northern cardinal. So we can imagine people of many different tribes coming together thousands of years ago in meeting places that you will find protected by the National Park Service, like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, Wapatki in Arizona, or in this place, now known as Aztec Ruins National Monument in New Mexico. Here they would trade goods and tell stories in kivas or in the shadows of ceremonial mounds. One tribe might have an explanation for a specific thing that the others hadn't explored yet, so these stories spread and got adopted into other cultures. Now, jetting over to Europe for a moment, few birds have inspired as many folk tales about themselves as the northern lapwing, this well-known and easily recognized bird of Europe and parts of Asia. So a Swedish story tells us of a young woman serving as a handmaiden to the Holy Mother Mary in Sweden. Apparently, Jesus and John the Baptist also spent some time exploring the Orkney Islands in Scotland, but I can't speak to how that happened. Apocryphal stories are what they are. Take them with a grain of salt. Anyway, the girl stole Mary's scissors, and Mary, a more wrathful version of the Holy Mother than we know, punished her by turning her into a northern lapwing. She chose the lapwing because its tail resembled a pair of scissors, and the lapwing has only one call. It says tavit, which in Sweden is I stole. Now, the northern lapwing is also said to have been present at the crucifixion of Jesus. This story tells us that three birds came to Christ's aid on the cross. First, the stork came and called, "Strengthen him!" Then the swallow actually tried to remove the thorns from his crown. And finally, the northern lapwing came and circled the cross with a whole different agenda, crying out, "Let him suffer!" Well, Jesus blessed the stork and the swallow, but he condemned the lapwing for all time. And now we have many stories about lapwings as mischievous or even cruel birds. The lapwing's bad reputation even extends from Europe into Asia, where a Russian creation story says that when the Slavic god Perun made the world, he gave all the birds a job to carry water to fill many indentations for seas, lakes, and rivers. Everyone pitched in except the lazy lapwing, who refused. This was all beneath him. So God punished the bird by declaring that it would always have to get its water from puddles. Today, if you want to see a lapwing, you need to look in mudflats with shallow water. Honestly, just as you would any other bird that looks like a plover. Now, centuries later, perhaps as part of its continuing punishment for all of these transgressions, lapwing eggs became a delicacy. The eggs weren't cultivated on farms because lapwings can't live in captivity, so the eggs had to be found in the wild, making them a very pricey item in markets, none of which was good for the lapwings. So in recent years, the practice has been banned by the European Union, but in the Netherlands, finding the first lapwing egg of the season is still a custom. And there's a catch, though. The finder now has to leave the egg where it was found. Now let's turn to some of the bravest and the most superstitious people on the planet, those who ply their trade on ships at sea. Entire books have been written about the omens and the portents brought by pelagic birds over boats filled with sailors, fishermen, or explorers. Seafarers especially revere the albatross. Any of the 22 species of these magnificent birds, including this Laysan albatross we were managed to capture when we saw it in Hawaii last year. For centuries, having an albatross around your neck has been synonymous with carrying a weighty burden that we cannot wait to dispose of as soon as possible. This expression comes from, of course, from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I will not recite for you, in which we learn that killing an albatross is the worst of all bad luck, inviting shipwreck and certain death. So how do we counteract this bad omen? The person who killed the bird must wear it on a rope around their neck, literally carrying the burden of their misdeed. An albatross, by the way, can weigh up to 18 pounds, so this penance is nothing to take lightly. Albatross lore on the high seas can govern the lives of sailors with endless speculation of whether an albatross following a ship is a good omen with a promise of the bird's protection or a bad omen of an oncoming storm with the bird hiding behind the ship to avoid the worst of it. Whichever it turns out to be, there's yet another twist to this. The albatross most likely carries the soul of a sailor lost at sea. So whether it's good news or bad news, the bird's protection or its warning are still all meant with the best of intentions. Coleridge's poem dominates seabird lore, so it may seem that albatrosses are the only bird that can affect a sailor's fortune. But the family of northern storm petrels also carry considerable weight with seafarers. The storm part of the name actually comes from their habit of taking refuge from an oncoming gale by following closely behind a ship and letting the large structure block the worst of the weather. Sailors took this as a dependable warning that a storm was on its way. Some, however, thought that this bird actually brought the stormy weather with it, making a flock of storm petrels at a ship's stern a very worrisome sight for a lot of sailors. In fact, some seafarers went so far as to call it good luck if a storm petrel happened to defecate on them as it passed over them, which makes this a good time to remind you of the first and absolute rule of birding: never look up with your mouth open. So killing a storm petrel, even in retaliation for the defecation, was and is still considered bad luck, as if the shooter wishes to invite bad weather for a very long stay. So if you want to find yourself caught at sea in the middle of a hurricane, all you have to do is shoot down a storm petrel. And as long as we're on the subject of disgusting things people do at sea, fishermen of old observed gray herons standing patiently waiting for fish to swim by at just the right distance, and decided that something about the heron's feet must attract fish. So they carried a heron's foot to improve their luck while fishing. And some even coated their fishing lines with a noxious goo they made from heron fat and feet. So as this practice has faded, we can assume it was not actually effective and maybe intolerably gross. I also learned some fairly dark things about birds' lives, which probably will come as no surprise to an Audubon chapter. And I made a point of including these in the book as well, because my readers need to know that some of the world's birds face challenges from people with selfish ends. The parrots of the Caribbean islands, for example, have been poached nearly to extinction for the black market on pet birds. Some of the islands have moved to name these birds as national symbols, which has released funds and organized efforts to save them. But on some of these islands, it's virtually impossible to see these parrots that used to be abundant there. You need special permission to go into wildlife refuges that have highly elevated levels of protection. And then we have the fate of the ortolan, a tiny bird that has had the bad luck of becoming a delicacy in parts of Europe. The recipe is gruesome. They fatten the bird up for more than 3 weeks in a cage, then actually kill it by drowning it in Armagnac brandy. The chef then cooks it and serves it whole, and the gourmands who eat the ortolan pop it down in one bite, but first they throw a napkin over their faces so you can't see them stuffing their mouths with this thing. Only the bill remains on the plate when they're finished. I'm glad to report that the European Union has banned this practice, but there are still corners of Europe where the name ortolan makes mouths water. Finally, let's talk about some birds that don't exist. As we've seen, long before we began to understand birds in scientific terms, miraculous flying creatures became part of nearly every culture's mythology. And sometimes the powers of actual living birds just didn't cut it. It did not rise to the level that the gods and the storytellers required. So birds needed to do something more: meld with the body of a god or a goddess, or become the lead character in a myth so vivid that it needs a supernatural species to tell it. So creating birds that have supernatural powers makes them larger than life. It allows them to attach all manner of deeds and stories to them. And this makes these mythical birds the catalyst for just about any situation that requires an explanation beyond the ordinary. They may have the ability to heal the sick, determine if crops will thrive or wither, bestow happy marriages and fidelity on couples, bring good luck and prosperity, or guide people to new lands where they can build their capital city. In Egypt, the god Tot takes on the mantle of a bird, specifically an African sacred ibis, while he controls the passage of time and the change of seasons. Tot is the god of the moon, wisdom, writing, hieroglyphic science, magic, art. So he's a busy dude, and the ibis head allows him to change the pace of the passage of time. On the flip side of this benevolence, a mythical bird called an uzlum provides an excuse for foolishness. It shifts the blame for mistakes away from humans and onto a bird too silly to behave itself. In British and Australian legend, Ouzlums fly in a spiral of tighter and tighter circles until it eventually flies up its own butt. I'm guessing that everyone listening knows an Ouzlum in some form. Now, here's the Feng Huang, or the Chinese phoenix, one of China's 12 ornaments or ancient symbols that denote the power and authority of the wearer. The ornaments date back at least to 2294 BC and probably much further, embroidered on clothing of high-ranking people in Chinese society. The description of this beast has changed over the millennia, so this one follows the more recent description, more or less. A golden pheasant's head, a mandarin duck's body, a peacock's tail, a crane's legs, and a parrot's bill. Wherever the Feng Huang appears, it implies the virtue and the honesty of the people it adorns. It often appears at weddings as a blessing of fidelity and harmony, and some households actually bring out their Feng Huang to display in good times and hide it away when times turn tough. Now, exactly how and where we acquired the legend of the phoenix has been a subject of debate for thousands of years, but it kind of solidified in Greek mythology. It's the story of an immortal bird who eventually tired of its cushy life in paradise. Phoenix traveled to the mortal world where things lived and died, but the bird knew that he himself would continue to be immortal. So one night, Phoenix built a nest of twigs, and as he waited for Apollo, the sun god, to arrive and take the sun across the sky as he did every day, he began to sing. Morning came, and Apollo passed over in his golden chariot, but the sun god so admired Phoenix's song that he actually stopped in midair to listen. Danger, danger, as he enjoyed the song, a spark from the sun dropped down onto Phoenix's nest of twigs, the nest ignited, and Phoenix burst into flames and dissolved into ashes. Oh, but all was not lost for Phoenix. As we know, 3 days later, the magical bird sprang up from the ashes, young and renewed. The bird realized that he could do this again and again, but somehow he understood he would have to wait 1,000 years before his next renewal. So he continues to repeat this cycle of death and rebirth as he will for eternity. So that, in a nutshell, is the complete language of birds, which, with stories about nearly 400 species of birds around the world. It's illustrated rather than photographic, as you've seen, with vintage drawings by a wide range of artists, most of them in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was an utterly delightful book to write, combining my love of birds, natural science, and history, and I hope it's as much fun for you as it was for me. Now, I will be more than happy to take whatever questions you have about the book and about our travels. Linda or Russ, are one of you going to, do you have a way of fielding questions?
I'm asking Russ. You usually do it. Russ, are you able to?
Russ, you're
Russ,
muted.
you're muted.
Russ, you're muted.
Could I ask a question out loud before you
Sure.
chat? All right. So first of all, thank you. That was so very interesting. Where can I get your book? Because I don't see it on Amazon.
Oh, it's on Amazon, believe me.
Is it?
Oh yeah, Complete Language of Birds. Note the spelling of my name, Minetor.
Okay, thank you. Everyone, usually at this point, you can just wait for a pause and then speak right up. There's no organized way really to do a Q&A.
I did have a question. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure,
I did
go
have a
ahead.
question about the the blue jays, and they're so vocal. Did you encounter any stories about them? When I was on the West Coast, I saw the blue jays out there, which I don't know if they're called blue jays, but they were equally, they just look like strong giant birds and very vocal. Did you encounter any stories about them?
There are actually quite a number of stories about jays, mostly the ones that are that we've most often encounter are from the southwestern and western Native Americans have quite a number of stories that relate to jays and give jays because they are loud, because they are bold. There are battles between jays and gulls that you know, of which two birds that were considered quite obnoxious, but the jays were a nicer bird because they also did things, in particular collected acorns and things like that were helpful to the Native Americans. So so they have quite a number of stories about them. Jays also like to torment Coyote, who is a major figure in a lot of Western indigenous cultures. So not necessarily Coyote the animal, but a person called Coyote. So so yeah, there's a lot about jays. And the ones out west, by the way, are either California scrub jay if they're out on the coast, or if you're down in the Southwest, those are Woodhouse's scrub jay. And there's some others out there. There's Pinyon jay and stuff like that, but but they have a very similar uh, personality to the blue jays we have here.
What the mockingbirds? I mean, they're so talkative and they're constantly learning. There must be a lot of folklore about that particular bird.
Oh, there absolutely is. Mockingbirds are, because they're such brilliant mimics, they often figure in stories where they're fooling people or luring them away from something by using their ability to mimic whatever voice they want, essentially, to bring people, you know, to bring people or animals away from their own children or from other dangers. So yeah, mockingbirds are quite the players in, particularly in American mythology. Yeah, I see some questions here in the chat. How do we travel? Do we have an RV? No, we travel in a Subaru Forester. We have two of them, and we actually I did I did quite a bit of math one summer to try to figure out if it was better to travel in an RV or to do all the cheap hotels that we do. The problem with RVs is that they get about 8 miles to the gallon. And my, you know, my environmental sensibilities would never allow me to drive one. So, and towing one also slows you way down and takes up a lot of mileage. So, we have found that we stay in cheap hotels. We do not camp. Neither of us can sleep on the ground anymore. So we, you know, we try to do things as economically as we can. And still we have stayed in some hotels that no human being should ever set foot in, but never for more than one night. So let me see. Are there any national parks you have not yet traveled to? Yes, we have been to 360 of the 430. So there are 70 remaining, most of them in California and Alaska. And if anybody's been to Kobuk Valley National Park up at the very top of Alaska, I would really love to know how you did it. Because the whole concept of the only way you can get there is by bush plane, and I have heard terrible stories about that. So I'm really curious how you managed it, if you did. Right. Well, somebody said, probably right off the top, the creator is female. That original Egyptian goose that doesn't lay eggs, well, this one didn't lay an egg. It was Jeb, the human who somehow laid the egg, and don't ask me how that happened. But yeah, so Gengin Ware, that original goose, actually cared for the egg, but, you know, sat on it essentially, but did not actually bear it. So, and actually not just any barnacle, the gooseneck barnacle. Yes, that is correct. And boy, is that an ugly little barnacle. Uh, so that is a creepy barnacle. So yeah, you can kind of see how people way back when got the idea that these tiny little barnacles became geese and geese became these tiny little barnacles, but laws of biology and physics, of course, make that totally impossible. Any other questions I can answer?
Yeah, Randy, I'm having trouble getting myself on screen here. This is Diana next to you. Were there any stories about swans?
Oh, yes. Swans, there are quite a number of stories about swans, and very often they are about how beautiful the swans are and how a man is attracted to a flock of swans, and then the swans land on a pond and they suddenly become beautiful women.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah, of course they do. And, so he watches them bathe and so on and so forth. And then he manages to kidnap one of them and force her to stay in human form for his own
Oh,
pleasure
yeah.
and makes her his wife and, all of that terrible stuff. But somehow, eventually, these women always manage to get back. And this is a story that's popular through Europe and Russia and some other countries. And the woman always manages to get back to her swan life one way or another. Either she sneaks off or he finally relents and brings her back because he can't stand to see her so unhappy. But one way or another, she becomes a swan again.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
Andy, I have a,
Mm,
should I go or someone just was ahead of me?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, a few years ago, I took a really cool picture of a great blue heron doing its thermoregulating thing on the shrine at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And my brother is a karateka, and he goes, "Oh, that's the crane stance." So we got into an argument, and I told him, "No, this is a heron, it's not a crane." And then I proceeded to look up the heron in, actually it'd be a gray heron in Japanese folklore. So do you have anything you would like to add to that?
Oh, interesting. Well, yeah, both herons and cranes figure in the folklore of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim. And boy, and there are just tons of stories about those, and I know that I have some of them in the book. It's not coming. My total recall is not quite total, but I know they're in there, and yes, there are quite a number of ways that cranes. I do remember that they impart wisdom, and there are often stories where they come into a home and become a person, and then after doing the good deed there, they go back to being a crane. So there are interesting things about long-legged waders figure quite prominently in mythology.
mm,
Great. And looking in the chat here, there must be some interesting folklore about ravens. Oh my God, there's a ton of folklore about ravens. Ravens are the truth tellers. They're the warning. They warn people of things to come. Well, Edgar Allan Poe certainly embraced that whole concept. And there are many stories about ravens being the dominant species. There were a couple actually that were so gruesome that my editor actually took them out of the book because ravens have also been blamed for killing people in some stories, and that's not the direction my editor wanted to go. So, yeah, ravens are good and bad in mythology.
Ravens were a feature when we were in England and went to the Tower of London. They keep them there and
Oh
take
my.
wonderful care of them. and they give them names, and there has to be a certain number. Do you remember what? No. And if one dies, they've got to replace it. So there's a
Oh
lot of
my.
folklore behind what that raven stands for. And of all places, at the Tower of London.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
you know that 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie that's in one of the
Yes.
nursery
Yes.
rhymes?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's a real thing. They used to, it at least happened once, but it became legend that one of the, I think it was I can't remember which English king it was, but the kitchen actually made what they called a surprise pie, and they put a bunch of blackbirds into a pie crust and covered it with a solid pie crust, and then brought it in to the king and the royalty at some special dinner, and suddenly lifted the crust, and all of these birds flew into the air. So it was called the blackbird surprise pie. And it's when the pie was open, the birds began to sing, well, and fly and crap on everybody. So poor birds. So that's interesting that they're also keeping ravens. Blackbirds have a lot to do with living in London, apparently. Oh. All right, somebody's asking, am I concerned about bird flu? Sure. That's what's affecting the price of eggs is bird flu and having to kill millions of chickens. Did I find any stories about disease? There are many, many stories about birds being curative of disease, not so much carrying disease. That's kind of a modern thing that's going on right now. But if you're concerned about that, they're not finding that that our backyard birds have any bird flu at all. So keep feeding them; they need it. But most of the birds that have the bird flu are domestic birds like chickens and ducks, and some birds of prey, but really only just a few that have probably got it by eating an infected chicken. So so this is something while we're watching it, we're being very concerned about it. It's not affecting your backyard birds. Okay, I see. All right. Thank you for posting the link to the book on Amazon. It's also wherever you like to shop for books on anywhere on the internet, they have this book. I mean, Target, Walmart, everybody has it on their website. So let's see. Okay, the
I
pictures
just
are
checked out Ravens at London. It says that the story is that the Tower of London will fall if the 6 resident ravens ever leave the fortress.
Oh, for heaven's sake,
So
how did I miss that?
they are protecting the tower.
Oh, that's marvelous. Thank you for that. I have never, I did
I
not come
Googled
across
it.
it.
You can
Wow.
thank Charles II. He's apparently the one that decided we should keep ravens.
Well, all right. Well,
Oh,
if you got to respect a bird, that's a good one to choose.
yeah, and they're very smart.
Yes.
Any stories about American eagles, bald eagles?
Oh, eagles figure quite prominently with indigenous cultures in the U.S. And of course, the golden eagle is much celebrated throughout mythology all over the world as being one of the most widespread birds in the world. So yeah, eagles have for being the apex predator, being the top of the food chain, there's a great deal of respect for them, and an eagle showing up in one place or another, at particular times can signify that a plan is going to go properly, or that the eagle is going to advise you otherwise. So yeah, there's quite a bit of I hate to say superstitious belief, but there's quite a bit of belief that eagles are actually kind of governing what goes on in all over the world.
Randy, on the flip side, what about the pigeons?
Ay, the pigeons.
That's
Well,
what I
they're good.
figured.
Right. There are good pigeons that we all that have long symbolized peace and love and all of those things. It's one of the things we discovered in Hawaii is that they release, a flock of what they call doves that are really just white pigeons, because the pigeons are able to find their way back home. So they release the white pigeons at weddings and all these destination weddings and things like that, where people are willing to spend a fortune. And
Oh.
many of those pigeons did not find their way home and have formed colonies in Honolulu. So all over Honolulu, you've got these gorgeous white pigeons,
Oh.
just like living it up in the trees in the middle of downtown.
And
So
oh,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just asking if these pigeons are white naturally?
Apparently, they've been bred to be white. They're
All right.
domesticated for this particular purpose. And probably, before that, they were probably racing pigeons and, things like that that have been bred down to this particular use over probably hundreds of years. So, so that's the thing. There are good pigeons, and then there's the ones we all know so well in our cities, which you gotta think about. These pigeons came to America as food. They were domestic when they got here.
Oh.
And they're just the most incredible survivors, and they're so adaptable that they now are living this wonderful life, essentially in our downtowns, eating whatever anybody gives them, and they can digest things that other birds can't, like bread. So, you got to have some respect for pigeons. I don't want them at my feeders, but
Oh.
there they are.
I can't figure out how to get myself on screen. I'm sorry. Otherwise, I would be looking at you politely.
It's okay.
Sorry. I'm not good at this.
Do you see there's a video icon on your screen?
Yeah.
Click on it. Yeah.
There, whoop.
There
Oh,
it is.
there you
Oh,
are.
I didn't know. I-
Welcome.
Okay.
Right,
well,
I see somebody's asking, how do we get an autographed copy? Okay, the way to do that is to go to my website, which is Minetor.com, and order the book from me directly. And I will be more than happy to autograph it for you. There's a place to leave a note. Please tell me what name you would like me to autograph it to.
what other birds?
Right, any other questions?
Oh, the nightingale.
Yes, nightingale. I don't get asked about that one very often. I'm trying to think.
Okay, that's all right, man. I mean, there's so many, you can't know all of them.
Right. Well, that's exactly. So, but yeah, that is definitely one that comes up in literature quite a bit, though. It's, as we all know, in Romeo and Juliet, and in many other places. So,
What else?
Randy, I wanted to thank you. Oh, I don't know. I'm not coming up at all. It's Linda talking.
yeah, I see you.
Oh, the question that I had asked, in your beautiful picture, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Oh.
But the pictures of like the kookaburra and that Fiordland penguin, are those realistic pictures?
No, they're illustrations. Everything in the book is an illustration, mostly out of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of them earlier, some of them early 19th. Like there's quite a bit of Audubon in there, and that's that this particular publisher wanted that kind of look to it, not photographic. This is not a field guide, but just to give that sense of storytelling to it by using illustration. So that's what we did. And some of them are quite realistic and some of them are very fanciful.
Like that penguin. Does it really
Yeah.
have the gold coming out of its head?
Yes, it does.
Oh my.
Yeah, it's quite a thing to see when if you find a photo of a Fiordland penguin, it's quite flamboyant.
Thank you. Wow, that was exciting.
Swan, pigeon, nightingale.
Here, I'll tell you what, I'll put the, yeah, okay. I'm just gonna put in here my website. Great. Any other questions, comments?
No.
No, just
Well,
that was great. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Oh, absolutely.
yeah, that was really fun. You took us all over the world.
That was the idea.
Thank you very, very much.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. This was a
Thank you
pleasure.
very much. This is really fun. I enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you so
And
much.
I'm glad you worked out the little problem with the link for us before it was too late because we couldn't link in. It's very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy.
Okay, thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you,
I
everyone.
want you
It's a
to
lot of work, all that research.
yank on this a
Yes.
little bit. Let me get underneath and look.
Gotta get out.
Okay. All right, we're gonna wrap it up then. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah.
And Linda, next month is Shoei Mitra, is that right?
No,
Oh.
Shoei's going to be in person. Next month is
Oh, the goat suckers.
the Goat Suckers. Yeah,
All right.
John, what's his last name?
Turner.
Turner.
Everybody, you're gonna want to see the goat suckers. Yeah, coming next month to a Zoom channel near you.
Right, will be Zoom in February also. We
Okay.
think it might snow, who knows?
All
And in
right.
March, we get together again in person.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so we'll see everyone next month. It was a lot of fun, and we look forward to the next time. So good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.